Hi guys, welcome to the Art of Server. So I want to introduce you today to this machine that you see right here. This is the HP T730 thin client machine. Now, a while ago I made a couple of videos on a very similar machine, which was the HP T620 Plus. And that machine was rather unique in that it had an PCI slot that allowed you to kind of expand on that machine and make it something other than just being a thin client machine. And in that case, I think I told you guys that it would make a really great little network appliance, firewall machine. And so the T730 Plus that you see today here is basically the next generation of that same machine. And so it's kind of an evolution. And in fact, this is even more powerful than that T620 Plus. So I think it has some other unique applicabilities, and we're going to discuss some of that today. So anyway, this was released in December of 2015, so it is about 5 years old now. The processor in this machine is the AMD RX 427BB APU, which is a 4-core, 4-thread processor with a clock speed of 2.7 gigahertz base and turbo up to 3.6 gigahertz, has 4 megs of cache, and has a 35 watt TDP, which is a little bit higher than the T620 Plus. The processor was manufactured on the 28 nanometer process, and so it's kind of comparable to the Ivy Bridge generation of CPUs. Now, as far as the CPU performance is concerned, if you look at the Passmark benchmark score for this processor, it gets a score of 2,486 for basically overall performance, and a single-threaded performance of 1,267. Now, if you compare this to the previous T620 Plus, which has the GX420CA processor, that scored a Passmark score of 1649 for overall performance, and a single-threaded score of 638 at a 25 watt TDP. And so if you compare those numbers, this is basically about 50% more performant than the GX420CA in the T620 Plus on overall performance, and in single thread performance it actually almost doubles. And so I think you can already tell that this has a much more powerful processor than the previous generation. But along with that comes with the 35 watt TDP instead of the 25 watt TDP. And so we'll kind of discuss a little bit more about that later on when we start thinking about how this machine can be applied outside the world of being a thin client. Okay, so along with that, this does have a graphics processor built in. It is a Radeon HD 9000 with a base clock of 600 megahertz that can boost up to 686 megahertz, has 512 shader cores, and this actually supports 4, as you can see right here, DisplayPort 1.2 ports for connecting up to 4 monitors. And in fact, you can drive 4 4K monitors with the onboard GPU. However, that sounds great in marketing, but if you look in the fine print, in order to support 4 4K monitors, it has to lower the refresh rate down to 30 hertz. So that's about half of the standard 60 hertz that most monitors prefer to be at. But yeah, so anyway, that's kind of getting into the fine print a little bit. If you are not driving all 4K monitors, then you can run it at the standard 60 hertz refresh. Okay, and so also you're going to see on the back here, we have a couple of USB ports. So we've got 4 USB 2.0 ports in the back. And these I think are primarily meant for use with like a keyboard and mouse and maybe a webcam or something like that. And you can see also that they do still have the legacy PS2 ports for kind of the unique requirements of a corporate environment where this was probably initially deployed. And we got serial ports and a parallel port, so a lot of legacy I/O connectors here. There is a 1 gig network port, and that uses a Realtek Ethernet chipset, and we're going to talk about that a little bit because there's some quirks with that you're going to want to keep in mind if you're thinking about how you want to use this type of machine. And we have an audio out and an audio in jack, and this is the power connector here. Okay, so on the front side of this machine, and you can tell this is actually very similar to that T620 Plus. The exterior design is more or less identical, other than that the color, this has kind of a metallic silver or gunmetal type of color, whereas the T620 Plus kind of had a dark gray. And so that's one of the primary kind of visual differences, but other than that, the exterior design is actually very, very similar. So on the front side here, we have two USB 2.0 ports, and we also have two USB 3.0 ports, along with a headphone with mic jack and then a headphone jack here. And of course, here is the power button. Now, one thing I will point out that I guess you won't be able to really kind of notice just from a visual inspection of this. This power button here lacks a tactile feel. Like when you press on this, you can barely feel that you've actually pressed on something. And this is very different than the T620 Plus, where when you pressed on the power button on T620 Plus, you had a feedback to your finger that tells you, okay, you've successfully turned the machine on. This, you can press on this and you might kind of wonder like, well, did I actually hit the button or not? Now there is a slight, you can feel a slight press on it, but it really is very, very slight. And so this kind of threw me off a little bit initially because I was so used to messing around with the T620 Plus. When I pressed the power button on this, sometimes like if I had a bad power supply connected to it, I'd wonder if maybe I didn't press it on correctly, and turns out like I pressed it fine, but the power supply was bad or something like that. So anyway, yeah, there's just a very kind of strange feel to that power button. I wish they didn't make that change, but anyway, I just wanted to point that out. Okay, so yeah, so let's go ahead and take a look inside this machine. Now to open this machine, it's a little bit similar, but also a little bit different than the T620 Plus that we've looked at in the past. But you still have to remove this back plate here. So you basically do this by prying open this little plastic latch. And now be careful, all this stuff is plastic and it kind of is a little bit fragile. So press on that, pull that up a little bit. And this panel then has little clips on the side here. And yeah, they eventually come out, just kind of go slowly and they'll eventually come off. And so, okay, so as you can see here, there are various clips, little plastic clips here that eventually come off as you kind of lift this up. Don't pry too hard, they do tend to kind of break easily, so I would just say kind of be gentle with it. You're pulling this panel off. Okay, so with the panel aside, the mechanism to release the top cover is a little bit different in this one. Any of the touch points, by the way, are still identified in green, and so you can see that there's this little switch here. You pull this down, and that will then release the latch on the top cover. And all you have to do is basically slide this upward like that, and it basically comes right out. Okay, so you can see here that the interior design of this case, the T730, is somewhat different than the previous one. And there's some pros and cons to that I'll get into in a second here. But in the previous one, if you recall, or you can go check out that video, I'll leave a card in the corner there for you to check out the video on the T620 Plus. But basically there was this plastic hinge mechanism that held the fan, and you had to move that in order to get to the internals. And so this doesn't have that, which I guess is kind of nice because that hinge mechanism with the fan was kind of clumsy, and you'd lift it up and it kind of fall back down on you and stuff like that. But there is kind of a drawback, and I'm going to get into that in a second here. But okay, so the fan mechanism now is just permanently attached, well, not permanently, but screwed on to the motherboard. It's right here. It basically sucks air into this area here and then blows it out this heatsink here, which is connected via heat pipes to the back side of this motherboard, because the processor is on the opposite side of what you see here. So this is kind of the bracket that retains the heat pipe, I guess, attachment to the processor. So basically, the heat generated by that processor is carried through the heat pipe into this heat sink here, and then the air gets sucked into here and blown out to the top of the machine, and basically removes the air out of the system, or the hot air out of the system. Okay, and if you didn't notice, just like the T620 Plus, I think you can probably see it through the camera here, but this entire panel, you can probably see my hand behind it, this entire panel is ventilated. This entire chassis is really quite, it's almost an open chassis really. There's ventilation holes throughout the entire side panels on both sides. There's ventilation on the top, and this is where the hot air is exhausted from. There's ventilation holes on the bottom, which I think is meant to, I guess, allow cold air into the system. And so basically you can get the environmental or the ambient air, which is hopefully is cooler, from the bottom and from both sides, and then the warmed air that removes the heat goes out the top. And so that's kind of the general airflow of the design of this chassis. So with regards to airflow, this is where I think this current design is a little bit, I guess, flawed, or just has a drawback, basically. As you can see from the way this is designed, basically the only air movement that's going to happen in this machine is the air getting sucked in to this fan and blown across the heatsink and out the top. And for the most part, since this panel is so heavily ventilated, it's basically just going to suck air from this side into the machine and then out the top. So that means that there's really not going to be a lot of airflow across this PCI slot here. So there's a PCI slot here. Let's get that in the camera here. So this is a physically by 16 PCI slot. It is a 3.0 slot, but it's electrically only by 8. So there's only 8 PCI lanes available in the slot, but this by 16 physical slot will allow you to add a GPU. And in fact, there is a GPU option that you can order with this thin client when they were brand new. So anyway, this PCI slot, again, like the T620 Plus, gives some unique possibilities with this machine, and we'll get into that a little bit more later. But one thing to note is that you really don't have any airflow going across this area here, other than kind of just normal, like if you have a card in here that generates a lot of heat, then that hot air will naturally migrate towards the top, right? So that kind of convection current might help move some cool air into it, but there is no forced air across this area at all. And so for that reason, I would caution about putting a very hot PCI card in the slot. Whereas in the previous design, in the T620 Plus, the fan actually blew across the PCI slot and then into the heatsink. And so in that case, you actually had forced air across the PCI slot, and which I think would provide better cooling for a PCI card that might generate a significant amount of heat. And so in this case, I would be a little bit concerned that there really isn't a lot of forced air across that card, and you're basically just relying on the natural airflow of the hot air from the card moving out of this box, and that then moving some cool air from the ambient air into the machine. So it's not ideal, but I suppose it works if you don't have something that generates a lot of heat. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Now, this over here is the memory slots underneath this shield, and so let's remove this. So this is just held on by 2 screws. Hopefully you can see that. Let me just remove this one first. And these are captive screws, so they stay on this metallic shielding, and this is clipped in on the side here by these little springs. And so you just basically pull this up. Now when you install this, be a little bit careful, because you want to make sure that this sheet metal is in between these little clips here. And if they're not, and you press down too hard, you might end up bending these and damaging them. I've seen that in a couple of machines, so that's why I'm just a word of caution about that. So okay, anyway, underneath this are 2 SODIMM slots. And right now I've got 2 4GB modules, but this is basically, according to the spec of the processor, this is a dual channel memory controller. In this case, it supports DDR3 low voltage SODIMMs, but the processor's memory control actually can also support DDR4, but it's just, this machine is not set up that way. Officially, the maximum amount of RAM you can have in this machine is 16 gigabytes using two 8 gigabyte modules in each of these SODIMM slots. Okay, but just like the T620 Plus, unofficially, I believe you can install 32 gigabytes with two 16 gigabyte modules in here. Okay, and I might make a video to prove, I won't do that today, but I might make a video just to prove that. But seeing that I was able to prove that that worked in the T620 Plus, I'm pretty sure it's also going to work in the T730 as well. So that also brings a couple of new possibilities of how you could make use of this machine. Now, by default, 512 megabytes of this RAM is reserved for the onboard graphics, the built-in graphics. That can be changed to a lower 256 megabytes, or it can be increased to a 1 gigabyte reserved for graphics. Okay, so I imagine that if you were trying to drive those 4K monitors, you'd want to increase the amount of RAM you're going to reserve for the built-in graphics. But by default, it reserves 512 megabytes of the RAM here. Okay, so as far as storage is concerned, you'll notice over here is a M.2 SSD, and there are holes for longer formats of the M.2. And right now I have a 32 gigabyte M.2 SSD in there. And this is really the primary storage I guess slot in here. Now, in addition to that, there is also over here a USB 3.0 slot, and so I suppose you could add a USB 3.0 flash drive in there as well, and boot off of. You can boot off of this, by the way, and you can boot off of this as well. And so there is that storage. I know some of you guys are not comfortable relying purely just on USB flash drives, and I've had mixed experiences with that as well. Now, a couple of videos ago, if you recall, I showed you guys this adapter, a USB 3.0 adapter, where you could install an mSATA SSD. And I thought about that, but when I tried to install that in here, that adapter was just simply too wide. The space here for the USB 3.0 port is just really narrow over here, and so it was very hard to fit that adapter in here, so I wasn't able to do that. If you could find a more narrow adapter, and really it's just about how narrow it is here, if you could find something a little bit narrower, it might actually fit in here. So you might be able to install actually a second SSD through some sort of adapter mechanism, if you can find one that's narrow enough. So anyway, those are really the only two primary storage options in this machine. Unlike the T620 Plus Rev A, there is no mSATA slot in here. And that was one thing I really loved about the Rev A version of the T620 Plus, was that you had the USB port, and I think actually you had two of them, if I recall correctly. Yeah, there was like two USB ports. There was the M.2, and then there was an mSATA slot as well for additional storage. And so the T620 Plus was kind of really excelled in terms of providing a lot of storage options. Unfortunately, that's not the case in here. There really is only an M.2 and the USB 3.0 slot in there. But of course, you could always get a very large M.2 SSD to fit in here, and those are coming down in price these days, so there's always that as well. Okay, now over here there is another slot here, but this is a mini PCI slot. This was primarily meant for a wireless card that you could install, and then you'd have antennas around the chassis for that wireless card. This machine that you're looking at today did not come with that option, and so you can see it's vacant. All right, so I've already talked to you guys about the PCI slot. So again, this is a physically, it's a PCI 3.0 physically by 16 that would allow you to install a GPU, but electrically it is only by 8. Okay, and in order to install the PCI card here, you have to remove this cover plate here. Let's see if I can show that in the camera better. So there's a cover plate right here, and again, all you have to do is lift this bracket over to the side, and then that will release the cover and allow you to install the card, and then you simply put that back on, and it'll basically pinch the PCI bracket and hold the card steady in that slot. So that's how you would install, and it's just a very easy little kind of latching type of plastic latching mechanism there. So as far as this PCI slot is concerned, again, just like the T620 Plus, this T730 with this PCI slot really kind of gives you some interesting possibilities. The T620 Plus, I kind of recommended that you could put like a quad port network card in there and make that into a firewall appliance. And you could equally do something like that with this as well, especially the quad 1 gigabit network cards really don't generate a lot of heat. And so that would be a great match in here, again, because of the cooling issue I had mentioned earlier. But so you could turn this into a network appliance slash firewall slash pfSense type of router. Now, some other ideas I had was, what if you put an external HBA card in here and made this into a NAS controller and basically use the external HBA to then connect to the actual storage chassis, like some sort of JBOD or something like that like I talked about in the R410 series. And so instead of having a full-blown server, for example, there are some really nice desktop oriented NAS chassis that can be used as basically as a JBOD, so you can just use it for holding drives and have a SAS connection coming out of it into an external HBA card in the slot. And basically then this has a stand that can come with it that allows you to stand this on a desk as well. So if you don't have like a rack set up at home and you kind of want to just leave things on a shelf or on a desk environment, you could have this as your controller head, put an external HBA card in here, and then have one of those UNAS chassis as just a JBOD for holding all your drives, and basically kind of have a NAS setup in that fashion on a desk. So that's one possibility, and because of the RAM capacity and also the more capable processor in here, and oh, by the way, on top of the more capable processor, there is also support for VTD and the IOMMU in here, which allows you to do PCI pass-through, I believe. I haven't verified that myself, but I have read that that is possible in here. So if you wanted to turn this into a mini hypervisor and take the PCI card and pass it through to a VM, you could certainly do that. And so you could have a mini hypervisor, have the external HBA, have something like TrueNAS installed as a VM, and pass the controller to the VM so that it can then control your external storage. So there's some interesting possibilities you can do with this thing. Another thing is that if you say forego the NAS type of setup, you just want a little hypervisor, but you want to do high-speed networking, you could potentially put a 10 gig network card in here as well. Now, I would caution again about the airflow. Try to pick a 10 gig network card that doesn't generate a lot of heat. We'll look at the power consumption of the network card and just try to find something that's very low power consumption. Okay, so now all that said about power consumption, when I turn this machine on and boot it into an OS, like I used Linux CentOS 7 on my little USB drive and let it idle, this thing was drawing about 16 watts from the wall on my kilowatt. Okay, and that's with nothing else added in here. So if you add a PCI card, obviously that's going to take more power. But as you see it right now, this is literally the machine I tested that on. As you see it right now, this thing idles at about 16 watts. So that's actually a little bit higher than the T620 Plus. Okay, if you recall, I think that was, I don't even recall. But anyway, go check the other video. I think it was about 6 or 7 watts. So this is actually, significantly more power if you kind of look at it from a percentage standpoint. But, in reality and from an absolute standpoint, 16 watts is really not a lot. Okay, and you do get a lot more compute power out of this machine. So, but anyway, with that said, if you're looking at this machine, for example, for a pfSense router or some sort of firewall machine, to connect your LAN, between your LAN and your internet connection, for example, and you're looking for a small, power-efficient machine to do that job, if the T620 Plus is enough for you, and it is certainly enough for me. I use the T620 Plus, by the way, as a firewall router. I don't use pfSense. I have kind of my own thing that I use, but I do use the T620 Plus, and I can route between 4 different networks at full gigabit speeds. I don't have a lot of like intrusion detection features and deep packet inspection type of stuff turned on, so I'm not really taxing the CPU much. But that machine can certainly handle kind of just traffic routing with a lot of policies. I have maybe like 200 or so firewall policies in place, and so that's a decent amount of rules. And the T620 Plus totally handles that without a sweat. I mean, there's almost no load on the processor really for doing that type of stuff. Now, I would imagine that if I did turn on some deep packet inspection and IDS and IPS type of features, the CPU would get taxed a lot more. And if you were planning to do that and you find that the T620 Plus isn't adequate, then this might actually be a great alternative option because it has the more powerful processor. Okay. Now, that said, if you didn't need the extra power or the extra compute power available in this machine and the T620 Plus was adequate, I would definitely go with the T620 Plus. And the reason being, the power consumption is much less, and therefore it also generates less heat. And for something like a router that's connecting you to the internet, you're probably going to leave it on 24/7 all year long. And so if it's adequate, why not choose the one that consumes less power, right? So I would go with that. So I would not be upgrading my T620 Plus to this T730 because the T620 Plus, for my purposes, with a gigabit internet fiber connection and the 4 LAN connections that I have, is perfectly adequate. So I'm not going to swap it for this machine simply because I don't need the extra compute power and I don't want the extra power consumption. Okay, so you could use this as a pfSense router or any kind of other network, router firewall type of appliance. But just keep in mind that if you don't need the extra compute power, I would really stick to T620 Plus. Okay, so other than that, as I already mentioned, with an external HBA card in here, this could make a very interesting NAS controller type of device. Now, one thing to note, as I mentioned earlier, this 1 gigabit NIC here, okay, it uses the Realtek Ethernet chipset. And if you're running Linux or Windows, that's usually not a problem. But I find that the FreeBSD and its derivatives have drivers that are maybe a little bit older or less mature, and somehow they haven't been updated for some reason, tend to have problems with the Realtek Ethernet controllers. And so if you're using this as a NAS and you're putting an external HBA card into this slot, your only network connectivity left is this 1 gigabit NIC, right? And so that kind of forces you to have to use this NIC. Now, if you were using this as a firewall, you can install a quad port NIC or something like that in here, and you could just basically ignore using this Realtek NIC, and then you'd be okay, and you don't have to worry about driver stability issues. But with FreeBSD and derivatives like pfSense and FreeNAS, this Realtek NIC tends to have problems. Now, I haven't tried the latest and greatest, so I don't know if that's still a problem, but I know for many, many years, the Realtek driver and FreeBSD tend to have a lot of problems, and you could work around it by downloading the source code for a newer version of the driver that was more stable and compile it and install it and all that kind of stuff. But it was just kind of not a very user-friendly, maintainable way of doing it. But if you really wanted to make it work, you could. Certainly, the source code for the driver for this Realtek NIC is out there. Okay, so keep that in mind if you're going to be using some sort of FreeBSD or FreeBSD derivative operating system. That Realtek NIC might provide some problems for you. Okay, so keep that in mind. All right, and so other than that, other than using this as a kind of a true NAS or some other type of NAS OS or a firewall network/network appliance, like I said, the other possibility is to use this as a kind of mini hypervisor. And again, you can install up to 32 gigs of RAM in here. You can do PCI pass-through, so you can pass through this card to a VM. Along with that, I'm pretty sure SRIOV would work, so you could also have a quad port NIC in here and basically break that out into virtual functions and provide each one of those virtual functions to various VMs that you're running in here. And so, so this could make for a very interesting, lightweight, hypervisor type of machine as well. So that's about it, guys, with this T730 Plus. So, question of the day: what would you use this T730 for, and what would you like to see me do with this machine? I haven't really decided what I want to do with this machine, but I'll kind of let you guys drive the conversation here. If you think I should try to set this up as a NAS type of device, as a firewall, or as a mini hypervisor, let me know in the comments. And based on kind of the feedback from you guys, I might decide what I'm going to do with this and what future projects I might do with this machine. And in addition to that, I also carry this machine in my store. I don't have a whole bunch of them, but I do have a few, and I'll leave a link in the description of this video if you're interested in buying one of these machines. The machines that I sell are fully refurbished. I make sure everything is cleaned out. These often come really dusty because they're usually sitting under a desk in an office environment for a couple of years, and they collect a lot of dust. So I make sure that you can tell this is a very clean machine because this is one of the machines I've already cleaned out. I usually clean out the whole machine, and oftentimes you'll find that these machines are also marked up with a lot of asset stickers and various things like that. I make sure all that stuff is removed, and so you're going to get a machine that is in very, very nice condition if you want to buy that from my store. So anyway, check out the link in the description of this video if you're interested and want to pick up one of these. All right, guys, so that's about it. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope this was informative about the T730 Plus. Definitely leave your comments and let me know what you think about it. And if you like this video, make sure to give me a thumbs up. And if you're new to this channel, be sure to subscribe to see more videos from me. All right, have a nice day, guys. Bye-bye.